You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
More than $800 billion. That was the total value of goods traded between Mexico and the United States only last year, making the two North American neighbors each other's largest trade partner. And perhaps that explains one thing.
China, 67%. European Union, 39%. Vietnam, 90%.
Mexico was one of just a few trade partners not on the list of over 180 countries that Donald Trump announced on April 2nd when listing who would face what he called reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them.
The Mexican government interpreted the exclusion of Mexico, a country that has faced its fair share of tariff threats, as a sign of success.
You see in the reciprocal tariffs the revival of the North American region. North America is going to be more and more important.
That's Mexico's Secretary of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, speaking with Council of the Americas members on April 3rd, one day after President Trump announced those reciprocal tariffs. He has been leading negotiations with Washington all this year. He told the audience his main goal is to maintain USMCA, the free trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Ebrard highlighted why this relationship goes beyond the volume of goods and how the two-way investment and production integration keeps getting more and more intense between the countries.
And the trend we can see in the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years, more than 200% of increase in Mexican investment in the United States.
Welcome back. I'm Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online. From the mineral fluorspar extracted in San Potosí and then sent to Louisiana for manufacturing that ends up inside lithium batteries, to steel scrap sourced in the United States and recycled in Mexico, or used Coca-Cola bottles collected in the US, recycled in Toluca, and then shipped back to create 100% recycled bottles. We're not talking about two economies anymore. If you're in business anywhere in Mexico or in the US, North America integration is probably your company's mantra.
This is much more than a trade relationship. This is a capital relationship that has to do much more with the balance sheet. Our assets together are worth much more than isolated.
That's Juan Pablo Del Valle, chairman of the board of Orbia. He was one of the CEOs of leading Mexican companies who spoke at this April 3rd event. Del Valle, Daniel Serviche of Grupo Bimbo, Arturo Gutierrez Hernandez of Arca Continental, and Fernando Villanueva of De Acero USA formed a panel moderated by Luis Alberto Moreno to discuss their investments in the US and the region's business integration. You will listen to an edited version of the panel. You can catch the complete presentations with the link in our notes. But before, trade expert Luis de la Calle of De la Calle, Madrazo, Mancera gives a presentation on the size of the two-way investment integration that exists between these North American neighbors today, and the importance of Mexican investment in the United States, which has been north of $5 billion per year for the last 4 years.
In recent years, Mexico has been investing more in the U.S. in proportion to the size of our economy than the U.S. has been investing in Mexico.
Thank you for joining us. We've been tracking the U.S. government's major policies on trade and how it is affecting Latin America. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Latin American Focus podcast and check out our guide on the website www.as-coa.org/Trump. Here is our ASCOA President and CEO, Susan Siegel, starting the event.
We are very pleased to host a vital and timely discussion today about Mexican investment in the United States, with a group of some of the most influential voices from Mexican companies. The origin of this panel is to talk about the unobvious, which is the depth and breadth of Mexican investments in the United States. We believed in the continued importance of this cross-border partnership for the prosperity of both nations and the competitiveness of North America. A special thanks to our Mexico series sponsor, MetLife. I now would like to introduce Luis de la Calle, who will open the discussion. Luis.
Few people realize that the degree of integration between Mexico, the US, and Canada in the last 30 years, and more so today, is a two-way street on everything. On goods, Mexico is now the largest supplier in the world to the US. We are the second largest market of the US in the world for goods. It is also true on services. Mexico has a very intense services relationship with the US across the board, from financial services to transportation services to medical tourism to education and professional services of all kinds. Tourism, of course, Mexico is the country to which more Americans go. Mexico is also the largest country in the world where Americans migrate and live. And surprisingly for many people, Mexico is also a large investor in the US market. President Trump made a very significant announcement of a major shift on international trade policy by the US. The most striking feature of the announcement yesterday is that, contrary to what many people were expecting, Mexico and Canada were not in the list that President Trump announced for reciprocity duties. The absence of that list reflects the level of integration between Mexico, the US, and Canada on goods, on services, on people, and on investment. That is the real reason why Mexico and Canada were excluded. In recent years, Mexico has been investing more in the US in proportion to the size of our economy than the US has been investing in Mexico. Mexico's manufacturing employment and US manufacturing employment are two parallel lines. We move together. When we create jobs on the Mexican side of the border in manufacturing, jobs are created in the US. When the US creates jobs on the US side on manufacturing, jobs are created in Mexico. These two lines have a 90% correlation index. So it is not that Mexico displaces the US when investment happens in Mexico. It is not that the US displaces Mexico when investment happens in the US. What this means is that when we attract investment from outside the region, from Asia, from Europe, we tend to move together. And even though the plants open up in the US, Mexico will end up supplying that plant. And if the plant opens up in Mexico, the US will end up supplying that plant. In terms of the markets, Mexico was the second largest market for the US in 2024. We bought 16.2% of worldwide US exports, and Canada 16.9%. And we supply the US with 15.5% of total US imports. This is quite interesting because it means that Mexico and Canada, we are larger as markets for the US than as suppliers to the US. And even though that's the case, we run a trade surplus, or the US runs a trade surplus vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada. But to truly calculate the size of the deficit the US runs with Canada and Mexico, we will need to correct these numbers by the level of integration we have in our economies, and therefore take into account that Mexico is a large market for the US, and therefore the trade deficit has to be corrected by exports from the US. So when you do that, Mexico is the 43rd country that has the lowest deficit with the US, or the US has a deficit with Mexico, once you take into account the exports of the US to Mexico, and Canada is even lower down here. In the last years, the US has invested in Mexico roughly between 10 to $20 billion per year. No, it varies among the years, but I mean, in the year 2022, investment was close to 20 billion. In 2024, 16 billion, so forth. Mexico has invested in the US in the last 4 years, north of $5 billion per year. What is interesting is that the US economy is 20 times the size of the Mexican economy, but US investment into Mexico is only 3 times. Why? Because Mexico is investing in the US in a proportion higher than our market share, if you wish, in terms of the ability of Mexico to generate resources in terms of the size of GDP. If we see the same cumulative from 2011 to 2024, the US has invested in Mexico $188 billion, and Mexico has invested in the US in the last 13 years, $38 billion. This does not necessarily include all the investment that happens across the US by Mexican citizens that live in the US, invest in the US, but are not registered in the registry before the US Commerce Department. Now, how do we look compared to other countries? The European Union was the largest with $119 billion, and Mexico invested $5.5 billion. So Mexico looks relatively small, but if you compare Mexico against economies similar to ours in size or in levels of development, you will see that Mexico invested last year more than Singapore, twice as much as Italy, 3 times China, 3 times India, 10 times Taiwan, and 20 times Brazil for 2024. So what I wanted to convey is that Mexico has a co-production integration with the US, which is quite deep, and we are beginning to have also a co-investment integration in the US that is much deeper than people give credit to. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Amazing information as background for this panel. And I am now turning it over to Luis Alberto to moderate his wonderful panel.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Luis, for an excellent presentation. You know, when one looks at Mexico and its relationship with the US, it's not only all the things that Luis talked about in terms of services, manufacturing, the deep integration and people, but it's the quality of entrepreneurs that over this long journey since the first free trade agreement that has made Mexican entrepreneurs world class. And this is, I think, what we're going to see today with the set of entrepreneurs who are chairmen or CEOs of the different companies, which sit in different parts of the production sector and in different areas. So let me start with Juan Pablo del Valle, a good friend who I've known for some time. And what I would like to do with all of them is the following. Describe a little bit what your company does, and then more importantly, talk a little bit about the investments that you have in the United States and what does it all mean in terms of jobs. Capital allocation is everything for any company, and how you think of capital allocation, where do you think, looking at the next 5 years, where your companies are going to be in terms of investments in the US?
Thank you so much, Luis Alberto. I'll tell you a little bit about Orbia. Orbia is a Mexican company with presence in 50 countries. We sell to more than 100 countries, 23,000 employees, $7 billion in sales, and we participate in different sectors. In the petrochemical sector with plastics, we do chemicals in the refrigerants industry, and we're significantly investing in molecules for lithium-ion batteries. But turning to what do we do, Luis Alberto, in the US, it is around 30% of our business. We have more than 2,400 employees in 14 states. We are in Georgia, in Illinois, in Ohio, Massachusetts, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, Wyoming. We're all over the place. Our assets are worth more than $3 billion. We believe that North America represents the most relevant opportunity for us. We have invested in the past in a very significant way, and we pretend to continue to do that. We're planning to invest in the next years around $1.5 billion in 2 specific molecules for lithium-ion batteries, where the integration between Mexico and the US is unparalleled. And we plan to do this in the next years because there is a fantastic opportunity and because we have an advantage given the integration. So I think what's happening with these new orders that President Trump announced yesterday is creating noise, but at the end, this will settle. The only things that make sense is that there is opportunity to invest. There is a fantastic market. We can be more competitive than any region in the world. And these investments from us and other companies, mostly in Mexico, will continue to happen.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Let's turn it over to Daniel Servige. It's a truly global company coming from Mexico. And so over to you, Daniel.
We are celebrating this year the 80th anniversary of Grupo Bimbo. We're also a Mexican-based company. We now have presence in 35 countries all around the world. We have basically a large percentage of our sales coming out of what we refer nowadays the North American Treaty. If we account for those three countries, we're close to 79% of our revenues are coming from these three countries. And if we exclude Mexico, 46% of our revenues are from the US and Canada. The number one country in terms of revenues is the USA. We have 60 bakeries in the US and 720 sales centers in 700 plus communities. We have presence in 48 out of the 50 states. And our operations are run basically by Americans. And we have over the years invested close to $10 billion in the USA. The company has been built due to reinvestment and growth, and year after year. At this point in time, what we have been seeing in the past, I would say 5-6 months, is a lot of uncertainty. A lot of uncertainty of what are going to be, at the end of the day, the rules of the game, the final landscape. And this time, we're basically finalizing the investments that we had decided before. We continue to make any necessary investments needed to keep our business strong and steady. But we're holding off major decisions in Mexico, in the US, and to be frank, in many parts of the world until the dust settles. We are sure that this is going to be a temporary hiccup. And let me tell you that our business is local. Fundamentally, bread cannot travel thousands of miles. Most of our business in the US is supplied by local suppliers and baked in the different communities. We're the largest Mexican employer in the US. We have more than 23,000 associates and independent business owners who work for us. I'm sure that the plans will resume and will strengthen as after these issues around the global trade get more clear.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Arturo Gutierrez. He's the CEO of Arcas, one of the largest Coca-Cola bottlers in the world, operating not only in the US, but also across Latin America.
Well, effectively, we are one of the Coca-Cola bottlers, one of the most important in the world. We date back to 1926 as the first franchise for Coca-Cola in Mexico. We started with a brand that's called Topo Chico, and now it's a very well-known brand in the United States. And that's our origin here in Monterrey. We have grown to serve more than 128 million consumers in 5 countries: Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, and the United States. In 2012, we entered the US market first with a snacks business in Pennsylvania, and in 2017, with an investment in the beverage space, acquiring a Coca-Cola operation in Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of Arkansas and New Mexico. And it's interesting to have a Mexican company operating such an iconic American brand in the United States. We're actually the only Latin American bottler operating in that market, serving around 31 million consumers. We also operate in northern Mexico, all the northern states of Mexico. So we're very well positioned to capitalize on the economic development of both sides of the border. In the US, we have 9,800 associates operating in beverages, 7 production plants, 1 additional plant in snacks, 37 distribution facilities. Since 2017, we have invested approximately $1.2 billion in the United States to improve our production and distribution footprint. We invested in a production facility in Houston, Texas, the only plant that the Coca-Cola system has built in the United States in the last 15 years. So we have a strong commitment to the US market. And we also invest in community programs and efforts supporting local communities. We plan to continue to invest in every market. Our total investment is around $900 million of CapEx investment. Of that, about 25%, approximately $225 million will be in the United States to expand production and distribution capacity, digital transformation projects, introducing new beverages, and also environmental projects. If we have this long-term perspective and considering how dynamic is the Texas market, particularly in the United States, that has had, higher growth than the average in the US in the last 7 or 8 years, we're still committed to those projects. 2025 is a year in which our ratio of investment, of CapEx investment to revenue, is going to be among the highest in the last 10 years, probably the highest in the last 10 years in our operation. And we believe that we are very well positioned to capitalize on favorable economic and trends on both sides of the border going forward.
Now, let me turn it over to Fernando Villanueva from the Acero, and the same question, where do you see not only the opportunities, the history of your company, but more importantly, kind of the set of investments and where you operate in the US? I know you're right now in Houston, so you can see where his interests are. So over to you, Fernando.
Thank you so much, Luis. The Acero is one of the leaders of producing long steel products, including wire and wire products, with manufacturing operations both in Mexico and United States. Why binational mindset? Because we source steel scrap, natural gas, electricity, and other manufacturing goods to the United States. We produce more than 9,000 different steel products, from one nail to wires that they go to the auto industry. So we serve different industries like construction, manufacturing, agriculture, especially here in Texas. And one of the things that distinguishes the Acero from other steel producers is that we do not source any of our main inputs from other countries other than Mexico and US, okay? So our steel, it's probably 100% truly North American steel. So both in Mexico and United States, we have more than 60 facilities. We are the biggest recycler in Mexico of steel scrap. We melt and pour that steel. We manufacture finished goods out of that steel. And of course, we do the distribution of our steel products across the US and Mexico. We have manufacturing operations in Texas and Missouri, recycling operations in California and Texas, distribution operations in Texas, California, Arizona, Chicago, more than 10 states of the US. We employ more than 6,500 people in our company, and in the US, we employ more than 1,000 people. We have invested in the US from the year 2000 up to date, more than $250 million, with plans of investing $100 million more, both in Texas, in our manufacturing and distribution facilities in Texas and Arizona. The Mexican steel industry, it's under a 25% tariff since March the 2nd. So even though our investment is going to be applied, our current investment, there's a lot of uncertainty, just like Daniel said. I want to explain you what we are living in the steel industry. We are the biggest steel nail manufacturer in the US. Nevertheless, our market share is really small. Why? Because there's an overcapacity of steel production, basically from China. And Chinese exports are distorting the steel market. I'm going to give you a little bit of facts on why we have the uncertainty of our markets. The global steel production in 2024 was about 1,900 million tons of steel. Out of those, 53% were manufactured in China. And on top of that, there's an overcapacity of 600 million tons of steel. And I fully understand why the United States are taking the actions they're taking against China and some other countries that act as satellites of Chinese steel. But I think we need more certainty to keep on doing the investments to create jobs. In the Mexican operation, we have the steel manufacturing. To produce 1 ton of steel, we need 1/10 of the amount of jobs to produce the same ton of nails. So we're basically sending the downstream production to United States and create jobs here. All these situations in the world and around the steel, we are right now undecided on how to move forward. Currently, the steel situation in the United States and in Mexico, it's uncertain.
Thank you, Fernando. I'd like to double click on something you just mentioned, and then again start the round with Juan Pablo. And it's this notion that Luis talked about, of the notion that what you really have between the US and Mexico is a co-production in which you get economies of scale and economies of scope. How do you see that? Because as I listen to all of you, it's clear that there is a combination of economies of scope that you reach precisely by having that interconnection. And were it not to be there, it would, at the end of the day, affect your consumers both here and in Mexico.
Oh, absolutely. We have assets that if we isolate them, their value is close to zero. If we combine them, you multiply the value by a big multiple. And I'll give you two examples. The US is one of the most competitive producers of ethane gas, which is then converted through crackers into ethylene. We own with our partner Oxy cracker, 1 million ton cracker in Ingleside, Texas. That ethylene that is produced in that cracker goes to produce another molecule called vinyl monomer that is then sent to Mexico, where in Altamira, in our plants, and in Colombia, we convert that monomer into PVC. It's thanks to that integration and to that very competitive gas in the US that is manufactured by fantastic companies with incredible employees that we can be competitive around the world with PVC resin, pipes, and fittings, and all of the integration. Another example is the reverse. The equivalent of the very competitive gas that the US has, we have in one mineral called fluorspar. We convert in San Luis Potosí, we have a fantastic mine where we extract the fluorspar, then convert it into hydrofluoric acid and Matamoros, and then send it to Louisiana and to many other parts in the US to manufacture molecules that are incredibly relevant for everyday use in the United States. But it is because of this integration. If the US didn't have that very competitive gas, we wouldn't be able to be competitive in Mexico, Colombia with our resin. If we didn't have that fluorspar in Mexico, we wouldn't be able to grow in the downstream businesses that we're in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Missouri, in Oklahoma, in all of these spaces. Just to summarize, this is much more than a trade relationship. This is a capital relationship that has to do much more with the balance sheet. Our assets together are worth much more than isolated.
Daniel, there's a lot of learnings across the Bimbo system in terms of distribution.
The company is a global one, and we try to take advantage of our scale and the uniqueness of the different sort of categories that we bake. And some of these products are baked in Mexico for the US market, and that allows us to have a better price and a better cost than if we only could produce it and sell it in one market, definitely. We're large importers of US products. Wheat, for example, requires a protein that you need to basically plant it in areas where there's going to be cold weather. We import most of the wheat from the US or sometimes from Canada or other countries. So the relationship is two ways. We still believe that that's going to be the case, and we're operating under that thinking. The relationship of the two countries has been strengthened and improved in other matters by this economic tie that we have between the industries of both countries.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'd like to hear now from Arturo.
We are mostly a local operated business. We mostly have local sourcing, but certainly aside from having a partnership with a US company in our beverage business, we do have also some trade between the two countries for very strategic and key ingredients mostly. But there are other examples of this integration, how we taken advantage of the possibility of integrating further our operations. And this is in our circular economy for plastic initiatives. We collect in the US used bottles, which is basically waste of very low quality that for technical reasons cannot be processed in the US. We ship it back to Mexico and we recycle that at our Toluca plant in Mexico, and which is the largest food grade recycling facility for PET plastic in the world. And we ship that back to the United States to be used in our products, in our plastic packaging, so that those products have a high content of recycled product. In some cases, 100% recycled. So this creates a very interesting cycle that has a very positive also environmental impact. So I think that's a great example of how we've been able to integrate our operations in many, many ways.
Thank you so much, Arturo. And let me now turn it over to Fernando.
I'm going to give you two examples. One example is that we have recycling centers, as I already told you. If we consider the amount of steel, raw materials that we send from the United States to Mexico and compare that amount to the same product that we send back to the US, we can affirm that all the steel products that we sell in the US has 100% US content. I'm going to give you another example of Missouri and our nail plant. Back in 2012, when we bought that company, the company was on the brink of going bankrupt. And the reason why is because of imports. If you compare the price of steel in the United States, in Mexico against China, Chinese steel is half of the price of the North American price of steel. How these binational footprint worked to maintain the nail industry in the US by using the scrap from the US, manufacturing the steel in Mexico, and send it back to Missouri to manufacture nails. And that's the way we saved the nail industry in the US. Honestly, when I arrived at the factory, the workers were shell-shocked, meaning afraid that we were going to close the facility and take it back to Mexico. But we did the opposite, okay? We keep investing, we saved a lot of jobs, and we still are the biggest nail manufacturer in the US, thanks to the binational, okay, footprint where we, as countries, we complement each other against the real competitor, those countries that they don't play under the rules.
I love to ask a question of Luis de la Calle because, we've heard here a number of things. First of all, the enormous integration that exists that is a win-win for all of the companies that we've just heard from. At the same time, there is a level of uncertainty that essentially is making them kind of observe where everything comes together. And then you have what was announced a week ago, where essentially the focus is on the duties on the automobile sector, where, as you correct me, Luis, but it's roughly 50% US content in whatever is made in the 4 million cars that are either produced in Mexico or in Canada. With the early signs that you're seeing, you think that Mexico can adjust to this new reality, and more importantly, the industry as a whole?
It is a little early to tell the impact that the announcements that made yesterday by President Trump will have on the economy. Markets did not like what they saw yesterday. The antidote to a potential slowdown in the US is to become more attractive for investment and to take advantage of the increased relative preferential access we have in the US market now. The key for Mexico to take advantage of the new trade policy run by the US, the US is sort of trying to do a fortress North America, of which Mexico and Canada are involuntary partners. The key for Mexico is, in my view, making sure that we have enough industrial capacity in Mexico to better comply with the rules of origin, because the rules of origin now have become much more valuable than they were before the US increased its duties vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So in two cases, in the case of slowdown and in the case of wanting to take advantage of the new preferential access relative preferential access Mexico has to the US, the key is to have a Mexico that is more attractive to invest so that we can vertically integrate more and we can grow more, even though the US might have relatively slower.
Thank you so much, Luis. And thank you to both Juan Pablo, to Daniel, to Arturo, and to Fernando for really great comments.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Lemi. This episode was produced by Gladys Gerbeau and Fabricio Ricalde. I'm the executive producer for the show. You can watch this entire event on our website and learn more about the Council of the Americas activities focused on Mexico at as-coa.org/Mexico. Check the notes on the episode. The music in this podcast is Milonga Gris by Magos Herrera, performing for America Society. Find out about upcoming concerts happening here in New York at musicoftheamericas.org. And consider becoming a member of America Society to enjoy all the cultural events happening at our 6080 Park Avenue historic headquarters. If you listen up to here, thank you. Check out other episodes of Latin American Focus on our website or write us an email telling what you think. Share this episode and the show with others with eyes on the Western Hemisphere, and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more, visit as-coa.org.